Let's start with a simple question. What do you know about the discovery of America? Most likely, the name that immediately comes to mind is Christopher Columbus, a brave navigator who in 1492 set off into the unknown, proved that the Earth is round, and discovered the New World. Every second Monday of October, the United States celebrates Columbus Day. The capital of the country is named after him, the District of Columbia, and statues of this man stand all across America. Only almost everything I just said is untrue. Let's begin with the idea of a round Earth. There is a persistent belief that before Columbus, people thought the Earth was flat, and that the bold Genoese risked falling off its edge. This is a pure myth, and a relatively modern one at that. It was invented in the 19th century by romantic writers who needed a dramatic conflict between a fearless discoverer and ignorant contemporaries. In reality, educated Europeans had known about the spherical shape of the Earth since antiquity. The ancient Greek scholar Eratosthenes not only knew that the Earth was round, he calculated its circumference about 200 years before our era, and did so with astonishing accuracy. Medieval universities taught Ptolemy's geocentric model, in which the Earth is a sphere at the center of the universe. No serious scholar of the 15th century believed the Earth was flat. So what were Columbus and the Spanish experts actually arguing about? The size of the Earth. And here lies the irony. The scholars were right and Columbus was wrong. He believed that the Earth was much smaller than it really is, and that Asia lay roughly where America is in fact located. If an unknown continent had not stood in his way, Columbus's expedition would have perished from hunger and thirst in the middle of the ocean. It was not courage or genius that saved him. It was a geographical accident. But wait, that's not all. Columbus was not the first European to reach America. 500 years before him, the Vikings did. Leif Erikson landed on a shore he called Vinland, presumably modern-day Newfoundland, around the year 1000 AD. And this is not a legend. Archaeologists have found the remains of a Scandinavian settlement at a place called El Ants o Meadows. There they discovered house foundations, a forge, and artifacts that unequivocally point to the Vikings. It's just that their discovery did not lead to permanent colonization and was forgotten in Europe. And finally, the most piquant detail. Columbus never set foot on the territory of the modern United States. Over 4 expeditions, he visited the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, and explored the coasts of Central and South America. He never saw the mainland of North America. It turns out that Columbus Day in the United States is a holiday in honor of a man who was never there, for a discovery that was not truly a discovery, and who until the last day of his life was convinced that he had found a route to Asia. But let's move forward in time, to the people who actually created the United States, to the founding fathers. And here there are no fewer myths, and perhaps even more. George Washington, the first president, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, a man who could have become a king but refused power, a figure almost divine in the American pantheon. And from childhood, every American child knows the story of the cherry tree. Little George received a hatchet as a gift, and, as often happens with boys, decided to try it out on his father's cherry tree. He chopped it down at the root. When the angry father asked who had done it, 6-year-old George bravely replied, "I cannot tell a lie, father, I did it." The father, moved by his son's honesty, embraced him and said that truthfulness was worth more than 1,000 trees. A wonderful story. It teaches children honesty, shows that even great people were once small, and that virtue is rewarded, except that it is completely made up. Its author was Mason Locke Weems, a clergyman and bookseller who wrote a biography of Washington in 1800, a year after the first president's death. The book was called The Life of Washington and was incredibly popular. By the mid-19th century, it had gone through more than 80 editions. But Weems was not writing history. He was writing hagiography, the life of a saint in a secular form. He needed instructive stories about the hero's virtues, and he simply invented them. The cherry tree story appeared in the 5th edition of the book, in 1806. It has no sources, no confirmations, only the author's imagination. But since we're talking about Washington, let's deal with his teeth. Everyone knows that the first president had wooden teeth. It has become a kind of amusing fact that adds humanity to a great man. Washington did indeed have serious dental problems. By the time of his inauguration, he had only one of his own teeth left. He wore dentures, but they were not made of wood at all. The surviving dentures, which are kept in museums, are made of ivory, hippopotamus bone, lead, human teeth, and metal springs. And here, the story becomes darker. In Washington's account books, there are entries recording the purchase of teeth from enslaved people. 9 teeth for 122 shillings. We do not know for certain whether these were teeth pulled from living people or teeth taken from the dead. The trade in human teeth for dentures was common in the 18th century. But the very fact is eloquent. The teeth in the mouth of the father of the nation may have been taken from people he himself kept in slavery. So where did the myth of wooden teeth come from? Probably from the fact that ivory darkens over time, develops cracks, and becomes stained. From wine, from tobacco, from anything. From a distance, it could resemble dark wood. Or perhaps people simply preferred to think about wooden teeth, rather than hippopotamus bone and the teeth of enslaved people. Now let's move a few years back, to the War of Independence. April 1775. British troops march out of Boston to seize weapons depots in Concord and arrest rebel leaders. But their plans are exposed, and along the nighttime roads of Massachusetts, a rider races to warn the colonists. "The British are coming! The British are coming!" he cries, and farmers grab their muskets. That rider was named Paul Revere, and his midnight ride is one of the central myths of the American Revolution. It is immortalized in Henry Longfellow's poem, in history textbooks, and in popular culture, and almost everything about it is untrue. Let's start with the cry, "The British are coming." In 1775, the colonists still considered themselves British subjects defending their rights against the tyranny of the Crown. Shouting, "The British are coming," would have been as strange as Texans shouting, "The Americans are coming." If Revere said anything at all, and most likely he spoke quietly, since the mission was secret, it would have been something like, "The regulars are out," or "The soldiers are on the march." Second, Revere did not finish his ride. He was stopped by a British patrol, questioned, had his horse taken away, and was released. It was another rider, Samuel Prescott, a local doctor who had joined Revere by chance along the way, who reached Concord, the final destination. There was also a third participant that night, William Dawes, who rode out of Boston by a different route. But almost no one remembers Prescott and Dawes. So why did Revere become the hero? Because in 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, the poet Henry Longfellow wrote the poem Paul Revere's Ride. Longfellow needed a simple, memorable, patriotic hero, a symbol of readiness to act at a moment of national crisis. Revere fit perfectly. His name rhymed well. He was a real historical figure, and enough time had passed for the details to fade. The poem became incredibly popular, was taught in schools, and the myth was fixed forever. Since we're talking about dates, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? July 4th, 1776, you will say. It's Independence Day, a national holiday, fireworks, and barbecues. But no. On July 4th, the Continental Congress adopted the text of the Declaration. It voted on its content. The actual vote for independence took place 2 days earlier, on July 2nd. John Adams, one of the main advocates of independence, was certain that it would be the 2nd of July that future generations would celebrate. And the signing. It began mainly on August 2nd, 1776. Some delegates signed the document even later. Some joined Congress only after July 4th. Others were absent at the crucial moment. The last signatures may not have appeared until November. The famous painting by John Trumbull, depicting the founding fathers solemnly gathered around the Declaration, is artistic fiction. There was never a moment when all of them were in the same room at the same time. And since we've mentioned signatures, there is a legend about John Hancock, the President of Congress, who supposedly signed his name so large that King George III could read it without glasses. A beautiful story of defiance and courage. But there is no documentary evidence for it. Perhaps Hancock simply signed first, on an otherwise empty page with plenty of space. Or perhaps that was just his handwriting. We do not know. Let us move on to Benjamin Franklin, the man who appears on the $100 bill despite never having been president. A diplomat, writer, publisher, inventor, scientist, and the author of one of the most famous experiments in the history of science. June 1752, a thunderstorm over Philadelphia. Franklin goes out into a field with a kite to which a metal key is attached. He launches the kite into a storm cloud. A spark runs along the wet string. Franklin touches the key and receives an electric shock. It is proven, lightning is electricity. The problem is that we do not know whether Franklin conducted this experiment at all. The only source is a letter he wrote several months after the supposed date. There were no witnesses except his son William, who never left his own account of the events. Physicists have calculated that if lightning had actually struck the kite, Franklin would almost certainly have been killed. A year later, the Russian scientist Georg Wilhelm Richmann conducted a similar experiment in St. Petersburg and was killed on the spot. Ball lightning flew straight into his forehead. Perhaps Franklin carried out a safer version of the experiment, collecting static electricity from storm clouds without a direct lightning strike. Or perhaps he merely described a theoretical experiment that could be performed, and readers took it as an account of real events. Franklin was known as a prankster and a mystifier. He invented fake letters for newspapers and wrote satirical pamphlets under pseudonyms. We will probably never know the truth. If the first part of American mythology is stories about wise founders and noble revolutionaries, then the second is the Wild West. Cowboys and Indians, sheriffs and bandits, the gold rush and railroads. This is perhaps the most powerful American myth exported to the entire world through Hollywood westerns. Let's start with the cowboys. In popular imagination, a cowboy is a white man in a wide-brimmed hat, with a revolver and a lasso, riding a Mustang. He is independent, taciturn, just, and lethally dangerous in a shootout. John Wayne, Clint Eastwood. These are the archetypes. The reality was completely different. Let's start with skin color. By various estimates, from a quarter to a third of all cowboys were black. After the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of freed slaves went west. There was less racial segregation there and more opportunities. Cowboy work did not require education or starting capital, only the ability to ride a horse and handle cattle. Another significant portion of cowboys were Mexicans. In fact, the profession itself came from Mexico. Spanish colonists began raising cattle on the territory of present-day Texas long before the arrival of English-speaking settlers. The word lasso comes from the Spanish lazo. Rodeo comes from rodear, to surround. Ranch comes from rancho. Even the word buckaroo, which means cowboy, is a distorted version of the Spanish vaquero. And what about the lifestyle? Forget the romance. Cowboy work was dirty, hard, and poorly paid. A typical cowboy earned about $1 a day, roughly the same as a factory worker in the East, but without a roof over his head and with far greater risk. Driving herds for months along dusty trails, sleeping on the ground, eating hardtack and beans, getting up before dawn and working until dark. The average age of cowboys was about 24. It was a job for the young. Shootouts? They happened, but far less often than movies suggest. Ammunition was expensive. Revolvers were unreliable and inaccurate, and killing a person, even on the frontier, carried serious consequences. There were laws there too, sheriffs, courts, not as effective as in the East, but they existed. And here we come to one of the main myths of the Wild West, the duel. Two gunmen step out onto a dusty street, walk apart, turn, grab their revolvers, and whoever is faster lives. This scene is repeated in thousands of films. Historians have spent a great deal of time trying to find documentary evidence of such duels. The result? There were very, very few of them. Most killings in the Wild West happened from ambush, in drunken brawls, during robberies, just like everywhere else. The idea of a noble duel in which both opponents have equal chances is a code of honor that existed in the minds of writers, not on the streets of Dodge City. The most famous shootout in the history of the Wild West, at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, on October 26, 1881. The Earp brothers versus the Clanton and McClory cowboys. Even it was not a duel in the classical sense. The shootout lasted about 30 seconds. About 30 shots were fired. The participants stood so close to each other that they could have reached out and touched one another. 3 killed, 3 wounded. Chaos, not a noble confrontation. By the way, this shootout happened because of a gun law. Yes, there were strict restrictions on carrying weapons in towns in the Wild West. Tombstone in 1881 adopted an ordinance banning the carrying of weapons within the city limits. Visitors had to surrender their revolvers to the sheriff or leave them at a hotel. The Earp brothers, representing the law, were trying to disarm cowboys who were violating this ordinance. So much for the Wild West without laws. What about the wild towns, Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood? Their names have become synonymous with lawlessness, but statistics tell a different story. In Dodge City, over 5 years, from 1876 to 1885, there were 15 murders. On average, 3 per year in a town with a population of several thousand. For comparison, in modern Baltimore or St. Louis, the per capita murder rate is sometimes higher. Now let's talk about those whom Westerns usually call Indians. The very word is the result of Columbus' mistake. He thought he had arrived in India, but the myth runs deeper than just the name. In popular imagination, an Indian is a mounted warrior wearing a headdress of eagle feathers, living in a teepee and hunting bison. This image is taken from the lives of the Plains tribes, the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, Arapaho. But this is only a tiny fraction of the incredible diversity of cultures that existed on the continent. On the northwest coast, present-day Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, lived peoples who built enormous wooden houses, carved totem poles, and created complex hierarchical societies based on fishing. They had never seen a bison and did not live in teepees. In the southwest, the Pueblo peoples built multi-story stone cities. Some of them were the largest buildings in North America until the 19th century. They were farmers, growing corn, beans, and squash, living sedentary lives in one place for centuries. In the east, the Iroquois created a confederation of 5, later 6 nations, with a constitution, separation of powers, and democratic principles that, according to some historians, influenced the founding fathers of the United States. And here is what is especially interesting about the Plains Indians, those very horse-mounted warriors with feathers. Their culture, which we consider traditional and ancient, actually existed for only about 200 years. There were no horses on the continent. They were brought by the Spanish in the 16th century. Before the arrival of horses, the Sioux, for example, lived in the forests of present-day Minnesota, practiced agriculture, and hunted on foot. Only when feral Spanish horses spread across the plains were the tribes able to become the nomadic bison hunters we know from films. What looks like a 1,000-year-old tradition is in fact a relatively recent adaptation to new conditions. Let's move on to the Civil War, the greatest tragedy in American history. More than 600,000 dead, a devastated South, freed slaves. And around this war arose perhaps the most dangerous American myth, the myth of the lost cause. According to this myth, the South fought not for slavery, but for states' rights, for its way of life, for independence from the federal government. Confederates were noble defenders of their land, not slaveholders. Slavery was a mild, almost familial institution, and slaves did not really object. The war was a war of northern aggression. This is a lie, and it is refuted by the documents of the Southerners themselves. Here is what is written in the Mississippi Declaration of Secession, adopted in January 1861. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Not states' rights, not economics, slavery. The Texas Declaration goes even further. It directly states that the federal government seeks to destroy the institution of slavery, and that this is unacceptable because the African race was rightfully held and dependent by nature itself. And here are the words of Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, from his famous cornerstone speech, delivered a few weeks before the start of the war. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. There is no ambiguity here. The people who created the Confederacy said outright that they were doing so to preserve slavery. The myth of states' rights appeared later, during Reconstruction and after it, when Southerners needed to reinterpret their past in more acceptable terms. It was a deliberate rewriting of history, and it proved incredibly successful. To this day, many Americans believe that the war was not about slavery. Now about Abraham Lincoln. He is often portrayed as the great emancipator, a radical fighter for black rights, almost an abolitionist. The reality is more complex. Lincoln did indeed consider slavery a moral evil. There is no doubt about that. But his political position evolved, and at the beginning of his presidency, it was much more moderate than at the end. In 1862, already during the war, Lincoln wrote his famous letter to newspaper editor Horace Greeley. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." The Emancipation Proclamation, signed on January 1, 1863, freed slaves only in territories controlled by the Confederacy, that is, where the federal government had no power at all. Slaves in the border states that remained in the Union, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, were not affected. It was a military and political maneuver, no less than a moral act. The proclamation deprived the Confederacy of labor, encouraged enslaved people to flee to Union armies, and made European intervention on the side of the South impossible. This does not diminish Lincoln's significance. His views evolved, and by the end of his life he supported voting rights for educated black men and Union Army veterans. For that time, this was a radical position, but turning him into a saintly fighter for equality means simplifying a complex historical figure. The 20th century brought America the status of a global superpower, and a new layer of national myths. Let's examine some of them. Let's start with World War II. In the American consciousness, it is the good war, a clear-cut struggle of good versus evil, in which America saved the world from fascism. This picture is not entirely wrong, but it is greatly simplified. Ask the average American who made the decisive contribution to the victory over Nazi Germany. Most will answer, the United States. Polls consistently show this picture. But here are the facts. About 80% of German military losses occurred on the Eastern Front, in battles with the Soviet Union. The USSR lost approximately 27 million people, soldiers and civilians. For comparison, American losses amounted to about 400,000. This is a horrific number, but it is 70 times smaller than the Soviet figure. Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration. These battles broke the backbone of the Wehrmacht long before the landing in Normandy. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the German army had already been bled dry in the East. This does not diminish the American contribution, Lend-Lease, without which the USSR would have had a much harder time, the war in the Pacific, the liberation of Western Europe, but it creates a more complete picture. Second, the moral clarity of the war. The United States fought against a monstrous regime. This is indisputable, but America itself was not flawless. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned in concentration camps. Citizens of the United States, many of whom were born in America, were deprived of their freedom, property, and rights solely because of their ethnic origin. Without trial, without charges, without evidence of disloyalty. Germans and Italians were not interned on such a mass scale. Only the Japanese. The bombings of German and Japanese cities claimed hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Dresden, Tokyo, dozens of other cities were turned to ashes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first and so far only combat use of nuclear weapons. One can argue about the military necessity of these actions, but to present the war as a flawless moral victory is to turn a blind eye to complex ethical questions. And third, America did not immediately side with good. Before Pearl Harbor, isolationist sentiments were very strong. The America First movement filled stadiums. Charles Lindbergh, a national hero, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic, opposed entering the war and made openly anti-Semitic statements. There were organizations in the United States sympathetic to Nazism. The German-American Bund held rallies at Madison Square Garden. America entered the war not because it decided to save the world from fascism. It entered the war because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and a few days later, Germany declared war on the United States. Until that moment, Roosevelt balanced between the desire to help Britain and the political impossibility of openly entering the war. Let's move to the post-war era. The space race is another source of national pride. The American flag on the moon, Armstrong's words about a small step for man and a giant leap for mankind. But many Americans forget, or do not know, that for most of the space race, the United States was losing. The first artificial satellite was Soviet. The first living creature in space was the Soviet dog Laika. The first human in space was Yuri Gagarin. The first woman was Valentina Tereshkova. The first spacewalk was Alexei Leonov. The first soft landing on the moon was a Soviet probe. When the USSR launched Sputnik in 1957, panic began in America. The satellite crisis, a threat to national security, lagging behind in education and science. When Gagarin flew into space in 1961, another humiliation. Only the moon landing in 1969 became an unequivocal American victory. But by that point, the race had already been going on for 12 years, and for most of that time, the United States was catching up. It is interesting how the rhetoric changed. At first, every Soviet achievement was a catastrophe, and then the moon landing declared the race won. Although no one ever formally established that landing a human on the moon was the finish line. Now, about the civil rights movement. The myth here is not that the movement existed, it did, and it changed America. The myth is in how it is remembered. Martin Luther King Jr. in contemporary American culture is almost a saint. Streets in every major city are named after him. He has a national holiday. Politicians of both parties quote him. The one quote everyone knows: "I have a dream of a country where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." This image of a moderate, conciliatory fighter for equality, respected by all decent people, differs greatly from reality. During his lifetime, King was one of the most hated figures in America. Polls in 1966 showed that nearly 2/3 of Americans disapproved of him. Among white Americans, his approval rating was catastrophically low, less than 1/3. The FBI considered him a dangerous radical. Director J. Edgar Hoover called him the most dangerous Negro in America. The Bureau wiretapped his phones, surveilled him, and collected compromat on his personal life. In 1964, the FBI sent King an anonymous letter with recordings of his extramarital affairs and a direct hint that he should kill himself. This is not a conspiracy theory. The documents have been declassified. King was far more radical than he is remembered. He spoke out against the Vietnam War in 1967, when this was extremely unpopular. He criticized capitalism and called racism, militarism, and economic exploitation 3 interconnected evils. Shortly before his death, he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a march on Washington demanding a guaranteed minimum income, mass construction of affordable housing, and radical economic reforms. These aspects of his legacy have almost completely disappeared from public memory. The same thing happened with Rosa Parks. In the popular imagination, she is a tired seamstress who one day simply did not want to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus, a spontaneous act of defiance by an exhausted person. In reality, Parks was an activist with many years of experience. She worked as secretary of the local NAACP chapter, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She trained at the Highlander School, where labor and civil rights activists were prepared. Her refusal to give up her seat was part of a planned campaign of civil disobedience. The organizers deliberately looked for a suitable person for a test case, someone with an impeccable reputation who could be presented to the public. Several months before Parks, another woman, Claudette Colvin, did the same thing. But she was a 15-year-old unmarried pregnant girl, and activists decided she was not suitable for the role of a symbol. This does not diminish Parks's bravery. Refusing to comply required courage, and the consequences were real and serious. But turning an organized political action into an accident means distorting history and diminishing the work of the movement. Another myth is that the civil rights movement was exclusively peaceful and non-violent, and that this is why it succeeded. King and non-violence, marches and songs, moral superiority over the oppressors. In reality, there was a wide spectrum of tactics. There were advocates of non-violent resistance, but there were also the Black Panthers with their program of armed self-defense. There was Malcolm X, who spoke of the right to defend oneself by any means necessary. There were urban uprisings, Watts in 1965, Detroit and Newark in 1967, a wave of riots after King's assassination in 1968. Historians still debate how these different approaches interacted. Some believe that the nonviolent wing succeeded precisely because a radical wing existed. It was easier for white America to negotiate with King than to deal with the alternative. Others insist that violence only harmed the cause. The only thing that is certain is that reality was more complex than a simple story about peaceful marches. Finally, a few myths about everyday life and culture. Baseball was invented by Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown, New York, in 1839. This story was officially recognized by the Mills Commission in 1907 and became the basis for placing the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, a complete fabrication. In 1839, Doubleday was a cadet at West Point and physically could not have been in Cooperstown. In his extensive diaries and letters, and he became a general and left many documents, there is not a single mention of baseball. The only witness whose testimony formed the basis of the Commission's decision was an elderly man with a dubious reputation, whose statements were vague and contradictory. Baseball evolved from various British bat and ball games, cricket, rounders, and others. Its rules gradually took shape in the 1840s, mainly in New York. There was no inventor, no moment of creation, only gradual evolution. The Doubleday myth was needed to give the game a purely American origin and a specific founding hero. Or take Betsy Ross and the first American flag. According to legend, George Washington personally came to the seamstress Betsy Ross in 1776 and asked her to sew a flag for the new nation. She suggested replacing 6-pointed stars with 5-pointed ones. They are easier to cut, and created the first Stars and Stripes. This story appeared in 1870, almost 100 years after the events. It was told by Betsy Ross's grandson. There is no documentary evidence. Ross really was a seamstress and did sew flags. That is true. But whether she was the designer, whether she created the first example, is unknown. Most likely, the flag evolved from various colonial and revolutionary banners and had no single author. And the last myth, with which it is worth ending, the myth of the 1950s as America's golden age. Stable families, low crime, a prosperous middle class, suburban homes with white picket fences, 2 cars in the garage. Leave It to Beaver, and I Love Lucy. Conservatives often refer to this period as a model to which one should return. Reality was more complex. The 1950s were the years of McCarthyism, witch hunts, blacklists. Segregation was law in the southern states and practice in the northern ones. Women were practically excluded from professional life. Those who worked during the war were pushed back into the home. Domestic violence was not considered a crime. Marital rape was legal in all states. Homosexuality was persecuted as a disease and a criminal offense. The prosperity of the middle class was real, but it did not extend to everyone. The GI Bill, which gave World War II veterans access to education and housing, systematically discriminated against black veterans. The practice of redlining, when banks and government agencies denied loans to residents of certain neighborhoods, prevented black families from buying homes in those very prosperous suburbs. The economic boom of the 1950s created a white middle class, but at the same time laid the foundations of racial inequality in wealth that still exists today. A suburban house bought in 1955 for $20,000 is worth $1 million today, but only if your parents were allowed to buy it. Do you know what unites all these myths? They did not arise by accident. Each of them served a specific function, creating heroes, uniting the nation, justifying policy, providing comfort in difficult times. Columbus turned into the founder of America in the 19th century, when Italian-American immigrants needed a hero they could be proud of, and when America was searching for its place in the world. Washington's cherry tree taught children honesty. The myth of the Wild West sold frontier land, and later, movie tickets. The lost cause of the Confederacy allowed the South to preserve its dignity after defeat and ease the reunification of the nation, at the cost of historical truth and the civil rights of black Americans. Myths are not just mistakes or lies. They are the way a society talks to itself about who it is and who it wants to be. The problem begins when myths are taken for history, when they prevent seeing reality, learning from mistakes, understanding other people and their experiences. America is a complex country. Its real history, with contradictions, crimes, achievements, and failures, is far more interesting and instructive than any myth. There is room in it for heroism, for tragedy, and for ordinary people who made history not because they were saints, but because they did what they believed was right. You just need the courage to look at it honestly.